It's an unfortunate fact of life that we all die. In the United Kingdom, a much greater number of people pass away in the winter months than in the summer. It's a sad fact that respiratory disease accounts for around a third of those deaths in a typical winter. Severe colds, flu, pneumonia all take their toll, particularly on the elderly. But even the relatively young can succumb, especially those with other health problems. That's the case every winter. The differences in death numbers are stark. Looking at the numbers for England from 2014 to 2021, the so-called summer baseline death rate for each 4-week period is less than 8,000 deaths per week. But during the winter, that number is typically much greater, and some winters take a disproportionate number. This video is a story of 2 Januaries, 2015 and 2021. Why are those 2 Januaries worthy of note? Well, in January 2021, we have been told we're in the second wave of a global pandemic that's resulting in a vast increase in respiratory disease and death. And in January 2015, no such pandemic was gripping society. But there's something that makes both Januaries worthy of note. The deaths recorded in both months are pretty much identical in terms of the number of deaths per week in the preceding 4-week period. To make the analysis easy, we look at the numbers compiled by the government's Office for National Statistics, and we're looking just at the numbers for England. In January 2015, weekly deaths were running at around 12,000 per week for the 4-week period in January. But that's pretty much the same number recorded for the corresponding 4-week period in 2021. So was 2015, even with over 80,000 flu virus related deaths, a particularly bad year according to official statistics compiled at the time? Well, no. The winter months of 2014-15 were recorded as moderate and lower than the notable season of 2010-11. It is of course the case that in spring of 2020, a novel coronavirus, COVID-19 as it was called, resulted in a significant spike in deaths. Total all-cause deaths during April were running at 20,000 per week, but by May everything was pretty much back to normal for time of year. The virus ran through society at an incredible pace. For most, it was barely noticed. For some, especially the elderly and the infirm, it was fatal. But while it came quickly, it went quickly too. But something came with COVID-19 that was not a natural phenomenon and makes our 2 Januaries very different. And that something is PCR testing. January 2015, in fact in every year prior to 2020, there was no mandated test that required the use of expensive testing laboratories in order to diagnose flu or other respiratory diseases caused by coronaviruses. Critically ill patients arriving in hospital in January 2015 were diagnosed by clinical staff based on an observable set of facts, symptoms, as well as patient records. After all, if an elderly patient with a history of chronic respiratory disease arrives in hospital with flu symptoms, the diagnosis is pretty clear-cut and the treatment well understood. However, from March 2020, the PCR test was rapidly rolled out across European nations, but particularly the UK, and became known as a gold standard test for SARS-CoV-2, the RNA virus that apparently is the cause of COVID-19. But the problem with PCR is that it's something of a haystack creator in the search for the needle that should be very obvious, because people who are sick with chronic respiratory disease tend to be very ill and very infectious. The problem with the PCR test for COVID is that it tends to label people who aren't unwell and aren't infectious. But now an entire empire has been created around PCR testing. The British Medical Journal reported in September 2020 that the UK government planned to increase testing capacity for COVID to dizzying levels at vast cost to the taxpayer. The BMJ had sight of a Boston Consulting Group presentation that had been prepared for the UK government, and the proposed increasing testing capacity from 350,000 a day to 10 million a day. The cost of this would be around £100 billion and would have the capacity to test the entire UK population weekly. The companies delivering such capability would include AstraZeneca, Serco and G4S. John Deeks, Professor of Biostatistics at the University of Birmingham, was quoted in the BMJ report and highlighted his concerns about the plans. He said, even if you have a test which is 99% specific, so only 1% of uninfected people get a false positive result, if you then test 60 million people, we will be classifying a group the size of the population of Sheffield as wrongly having COVID, leading to substantial economic harm and massive need for further testing. The Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, has become obsessional about the need for testing. Testing, tracking, isolating, and lockdowns based on testing data has become the central plank of government policy, and spending has escalated to levels never before seen in peacetime. And yet all of this frantic activity is happening against a background of no real increase in all-case fatality or significantly increased excess winter deaths. But you'd be forgiven for not getting this message. The government has pinned its reputation on a policy built on testing and may well have come too far to admit that the entire basis of its COVID response is flawed. And they'll point out that other nations are doing very similar things. But the world often looks to the United Kingdom to take a lead in clinical excellence. We repeat often enough that our NHS is apparently the envy of the world. Looking at the data again, it appears that testing is the greater problem in explaining the so-called second wave of COVID this winter, because the numbers look very much like any other winter, and some winters have been much worse. The way deaths are categorised tends to confirm this. More deaths this winter have been categorised as COVID-19, but of course such a category didn't exist before 2020. It means that there has been a significant decline in deaths from other things one would expect to cause death at this time of year. In fact, from September to December 2020, there were, according to the stats, nearly 11,000 less deaths from those other typical causes of death, like flu, pneumonia, emphysema, and chronic pulmonary disease. Testing is the problem. We're using a test to define people and NHS staff as sick and infectious when they clearly aren't. The winter of 20 and early 21 had a high death toll, just like the winter of 2014-15. But the cost to our society of lockdown is simply too great to justify. The data indicate that the virus will find its victims, but thankfully it has largely done its damage, and the greatest damage being done now is by this government on its people. There's another problem. We all have the right, it's an inalienable right in a democratic society, to question the decisions being taken by the government in our name. When the government uses advertising designed to make people feel guilty about leaving their homes or seeing their families for fear of infecting others, a Rubicon has been crossed. Putting an entire population under house arrest and denying them the right to free thought or free expression or free association is simply not acceptable. We have the right to question a policy that asks us to accept that the healthy will make others ill, all based on the result of a testing regime that we've never relied on before, that's built on a false premise and isn't fit for purpose. Certain facts are undeniable. Our small businesses are being destroyed. Our business risk takers are losing their livelihoods. Our children are being denied education, and as a nation, our dependence on sovereign debt is without parallel. And our liberty, our freedom, our free speech is coming under attack by the people we elected to serve us. We deserve better. The lockdowns must end, and the loss of what we stand for as a people must be given back. It's all we ask. Give us back the things that make life good.